Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Sugar number 8 on this very cold day in Johannesburg. I know everyone's dialed in across the region, and a big thank you for that as well. We're very tight on timelines today. We have a dead stop at 10 o'clock. So in order to commence and allow each presenter their valued time to present, I'm just going to go through the agenda and some housekeeping rules. And so firstly, a very, very big warm welcome to Professor Nicola Klein. Nicola is our guest speaker today, and we have decided to go international. And Nicola has dialed in from the Netherlands. Just to go through Nicola's brief agenda and title of her presentation today, I'm very honored to have her today. She is the Dean of Executive Education of Rotterdam School of Management in Erasmus University, and the title of Nicola's presentation today is Managing a Company's Reputation in a Digital Age. In terms of Nicola's biography, Nicola is the Dean of Post-Experience Education at Rotterdam School of Management and Professor of Corporate Marketing, former Dean of Gibbs University in Johannesburg, and an expert in corporate branding and reputation. And Nicola has written a publication, a book, and this book is called When a Crisis Strikes. It gives me a great honor to have Nicola today to present. Nicola tutored me at Gordon Institute of Business Science previously, and I have been on the panel before with Nicola as the MC at Gordon Institute of Business Science. A huge welcome to you, Nicola, and a big thank you.
Lovely to see you, Brandon. I know you're going to introduce everybody else, but I turned on my camera, so I just wanted to say hi.
Thank you so much, and thank you for dialing in from abroad. Then secondly, in terms of the agenda, a huge welcome to Russell Hollick as well. A lot of you know Russell. Russell is the Chief Software Architect at Syspro Corporate. Russell has been with Syspro for 40 years plus, and Russell also sits on the Global Exco. Huge welcome to you as well, and we look forward to your really profound presentation, and Russell, around defining what is Avanti. Thirdly, gives me great pleasure to welcome Frans Skuman and Simon Conradi in a pre-sales capacity. These two gentlemen don't need much introduction because they've followed the journey of a lot of our customers and partners to position Syspro inventory optimization. And ultimately, Frans and Simon will do a collaborative presentation, having a conversation between themselves, which will be prompted by some slides, and they will bring in some live scenarios on the journey that we followed through some customers and the journey how we've won some inventory optimization positioning in our client base and in our users. There's been a slight change to topic number 4. Unfortunately, Donnell Richards can't make the presentation today, so there'll be a solo with Gerard Steenberg representing RCL Foods. Gerard is the operations executive at RCL Foods, so a huge thank you to you, and thank you for taking the reign today on a solo, and obviously go through the journey on how we collaborated with Syspro and how we followed the journey with Syspro and RCL over the 4 years that I've been at Syspro. RCL is one of my key accounts and a customer that I hold very close to my heart on how we've actually collaborated through the 4 years and added value to RCL. So thank you, Gerard, for taking that reign alone today. And then finally, a very interesting case study, that this will be a collaborative approach as well, more of a conversation versus a PowerPoint presentation between Wesley Kennedy of Blue Mining and the partner, Amelia Badenhorst of Imperium. So a huge thank you to you as well. And I know that Syspro is a partner or partner-centric organization. So this will add value to the partner-centric organization, or one of our pillars that we endorse, being a partner-centric organization. So RCL will talk around the why they decided to ring fence everything in Syspro, from the key account management, using professional services, and following their journey at RCL Foods. And then obviously point 5 will be how the partner and the customer collaborated in a successful manner. And then finally, I've also asked Jannie Steyn, who's a board member of the user group, to do the wrap up and take away something profound per presentation, and just thank everybody and take away a finding per presentation, and also from you, Nicola, in your keynote. So Jannie Steyn is the Chief Information Officer of Rhodes Foods Group, also a customer of mine, and a huge congratulations I'd like to say to you, being the first customer globally to go version 8 2022 a couple of weeks back. Great accolade to you and your team, Jannie, so thank you for that. In terms of some housekeeping, we've allowed for some time after Nicola's presentation for some Q&A. But ultimately, per presentation, if you'd like to ask some questions for the Q&A, please post them at the bottom of the presentation or the screen, and we will answer those questions and answers at the end of the session before Jannie takes over. So thank you for that. I'd also like to say thank you to both marketing departments, the Syspro marketing department and our external marketing department called Fizz, for their great support on logistics and helping us get to where we are today for Sugar 8. I'd also like to say thank you to the other panelists, the other board members, which is Bongani from Umfalazi Sugar and Julie Ann from Delhi Spices, for their collaboration on sugar. It's been a great journey getting to where we are today, I must say, as the chairperson of Sugar. When we launched, I think 3 years back on Sugar, we only had 46 delegates attending. Today, I'm very pleased to see that there have been 362 registrations. The numbers are climbing in terms of participants at the moment. A lot of people are sitting together in boardrooms, so the numbers may be a little bit distorted, but ultimately 362 people have registered today, which is customers and partners. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to the presenters. Thank you to you, Nicola, for joining from afar. I'm really excited to listen to your presentation. And you and I have traveled this journey for a good 20 years. So thank you for agreeing, and I look forward to your presentation. Over to you, and thank you.
Thanks, Brandon. Good morning, everybody. I'm sorry to hear you're a little cold. We in Rotterdam were told last week, I learned that we've been at under 15 degrees for 186 days. So join my world. It's starting to get warmer here. But it's lovely to be dialing into the region and talking all things African. And Brandon has me on a very strict timeline. So I actually set a timer, which I'm going to activate quickly because it needs to go, so that we can make sure that we stick to time. And if you have comments as I go, please feel free to put them in the questions box. It doesn't have to just be for questions. It can be for comments. But I'm going to start slide sharing in a moment, and we're going to speak a little bit about the topic for today, which, as you can see, is managing your company's reputation in a digital age. And you're going to see storm clouds there. That's not because all of you have stormy reputations. It's because I want to focus today on when things go a little bit south and when we start hitting crises, as Brandon mentioned a little bit earlier. But I guess in terms of thinking about your world and the world that you're in, I guess we spend a lot of our time focusing within the four walls, and you're focusing on operating in factories, distribution systems, data flows, etc. But at the end of the day, you've also got out there a whole lot of stakeholders. And when things are going great, that's fantastic. So, we're working with them, we're thinking with them, we're hopefully building your relationships, we're acting together. But there comes a time sometimes where instead of being able to ride the wave, what starts happening is we can't surf anymore. A little bit. I guess, when we think about a digital age, what does it mean to be in a digital age? For me, what we've started to see is a dramatic increase in the number of reputational crises. And I really think that some of that can be linked to digitization. I think that going digital provides its own challenges. So one of the stories that we'll be looking at today is going to be around a data breach. But the moment we start going digital, and we can't avoid digitizing, it does expose us to different risks. But it's not only that. When we start looking at what digitization has meant in our world today, it's all about hyperconnectivity. Now, that means that everybody's online all the time. And what that starts meaning is, sadly, when we do a good job, people don't speak as much. But the moment things start going wrong, the news travels, and the news travels incredibly fast. And it doesn't just travel fast anymore because of media, formal media. In today's world, every consumer is a producer. One of the stories that we covered in the book was a small crisis that was faced actually by Kentucky Fried Chicken, with spotted in a restaurant, somebody walked outside for consumption. That you get consumers out there with one camera with something going wrong, and suddenly you are no longer dealing with an issue. You have to start, as I said, swimming. So when it becomes a crisis, and in an era also of fake news, we have to be very clear about how we're going to communicate. So these are not things that we think about every day. It's you're focused, I would imagine, in your worlds around more regular activities, but having spent a little time thinking about crises, I think, is something that's really important. And as Brandon mentioned, in 2018, 2019, Frances Hurd, who some of you may have seen, she's a journalist on SABC, a former student of mine, a colleague, a friend, contacted me, and she said to me, Nicola, I need you to write a book with me. And I said to her, Frances, I'm too busy. I'm not writing a book. I'm trying to run a business school here. And she said to me, no, the number of crises that are happening, and what I'm seeing is I'm seeing crises happen to good companies. I'm not talking here about brands that behave badly. I'm talking about fundamentally good companies. And suddenly they start falling apart, when the proverbial hits the fan. And, can we help them with some lessons? The literature. We've got a whole lot of stories. We were obviously facing serious issues regarding state capture as well, and companies implicated in that. And so we started surveying, and we wrote the book around what we call 10 rules to manage in a crisis. But we spoke about a lot of different kind of stories in that. And today, what I want to do is I want to focus on two. Before I get to them, people sometimes say to me, well, what is a crisis? We're constantly dealing with issues. The word crisis actually comes from the Latin, and it refers to the progression of a disease. It's when a disease reaches a turning point that it can't be treated in the normal course of events. It has to be treated differently. And this is where I say, when you have to start swimming, it's not necessarily a crisis, but when you're starting to feel that you're dumped in that wave and you can't get out of the wave, then you've hit a crisis. And as I said, we cover quite a few in the book, but today I want to focus on two. Because I know there are many of you who are involved in the foods industry. I want to speak about the Tiger Brands listeriosis crisis and take a couple of lessons out of that. I also want to focus on something that really didn't end up becoming too much of a crisis, but it could have been. It played out in 2018 as well. And that was a data breach for Liberty and how that was handled. And because of time, we are not going to cover all 10 rules in the book, but what I am going to do is identify 6 of the principles and use these stories to speak about them. Now, did I go and interview Liberty? Did I go into their factories? Did I speak to them? No. Frances and I pulled all the information in the book from publicly available sources. We referenced it. And so today you may have inside stories around these, particularly those of you who are in the food industry may have been involved in the acquisition of enterprise. But we may be basing our stories on externally available media and reports. And that is, of course, what your stakeholders are going to use as well. Other than your employees, perhaps your shareholders have inside views, but by and large, it's what is said about the organization outside that actually drives the sentiment to that organization. So there may well be facts and figures that you know on the inside are different. I'm coming from the view of the outsider, along with all of your customers, your suppliers, and the other stakeholders that make your world and make your company what it is. Let's start with the Tiger brand story. Perhaps it's worth just noting that this was played out in 2018. Tiger Brands didn't have, I would imagine, or somebody didn't have a most fantastic Valentine's Day in 2018, because on the 14th, they received notification, the 14th of February, they received notification of some detection of listeria, the bacteria that causes listeriosis. I don't know what happened, but we do know, and I don't have the exact patterns of the deaths, but we do know that shortly before the end of February, there were already 170 people that had died from an outbreak of listeriosis in South Africa. We also know that the news of where the outbreak came from was not released by the company itself. It was announced by Aaron Motsoaledi, the then Minister of Health, and it was confirmed that the source of the outbreak was the Enterprise Food Production Facility in Polokwane. Lawrence McDougall, the then CEO of Tiger Brands, responded. I think it was Lawrence, actually, he certainly came out the next day, but the response was that we found this low detection, but the presence of the strain has not been confirmed by our tests. So a very kind of, one might say, mechanical response, nothing that evinced any concern or anything like that. And when it came out that it was, in fact, coming from the Tiger Brands facility on the 4th of March, McDougall continued to display this. He said, there's no direct link with the deaths to our product that we're aware of at this point, nothing. Now, he was actually asked also in that same interview whether he'd taken legal advice, and he said, well, when you're on the right side of things, and I'm not quoting directly here, but it's in the book, when you're on the right side of things, you don't need lawyers. Now, if we start looking at what this, and typically people will turn around and say, well, it must be about something like communicate effectively or show empathy or something like that. The first rule in any crisis is to minimize harm, because this is the piece. It's not always going to be a question that human lives are at stake, but it's the one thing that if you are unavailable, and I'll speak about that a little later, if you are unavailable to deal with stakeholders in a crisis because you're out there minimizing harm, and I think in some ways some of the companies that have really got this right are mining. In the mining industry, you get in there and you minimize harm, and that's the first step to do. So it might sound like it's absolutely self-evident, but people need information. And by not actually coming out and sharing the possibility that that strain could have come out of that plant, people's lives were threatened. Psychologically, we need information. And I wanted to just read something for you in a press release, and I'm reading directly from the book. When McDougall came out on the 5th of March, I'm just going to read a quick paragraph. McDougall and the executives flanking him were asked when they had last eaten Enterprise polony. It was the perfect opportunity to say that eating Enterprise products was the last thing anyone should be doing at the time. Instead, McDougall smiled, and another executive implied it was the sensible thing to do. Polony? I'm not sure, said McDougall, pondering the question. I've had sausages and Viennas probably 4 or 5 weeks ago. When asked what brand, he lifted an eyebrow and replied, Enterprise, no doubt. Yesterday, I had pizza with chopped ham, interjected the Chief Corporate Affairs Officer, Mary Jane Marifi. And if you looked in my fridge right now, you'd see an eaten polony, Enterprise polony. I'm good, she added. And again, I'm good. This is not preventing harm. And so, that would be the first lesson that we speak about in a crisis. I'm going to move along to the next person. I'll be returning to Tiger. That story is not over, but I want to move across to Liberty. And this is, as I said, not a news company that you're going to find, or a news item you're going to find that much about. But if you go and Google Liberty data breach, just to give you a few very, very short points about it. This was a little after Tiger. 2018 was not a good year for crises. Liberty received a demand to pay ransom. So this was on the evening of the Thursday following a hacking of their client base. By the afternoon of the 16th of June, all affected customers had been alerted that their data had been hacked, that they couldn't find anything that had happened to the data thus far. They were contacted in an individual capacity. There is nothing worse than reading that your data has been in the news. Ideally, you actually want to be contacted by the company. I'll come back to a little more of the story later, but straight afterwards, the then Liberty CEO, Dave Munro, started engaging with the press. And that leads us to a second principle when we start talking about crisis management, and that is to respond quickly. Now, sometimes people will say to me, but we don't have all the facts. We can't respond. You're never going to have all of the facts at your disposal at the beginning, but actually getting out there. And if you are of the belief that actually there is really nothing to worry about, one can get out there and say that we're not overly concerned, but we take these kind of things seriously. And so we're investigating. But to say nothing because you don't have anything to say doesn't work in crisis management. And the risk here is that if you don't get out, what happens is something called, let me just go back a step here, something called framing starts happening. So when you don't speak in a crisis, you create a space for others to come in and start framing what is being said and what's happening in that crisis. And then you're on the back foot, because what you're trying to do is actually respond to other commentators rather than being on the front foot and actually owning the space. Now, I first learned about the Liberty data breach on my way. I was driving to Gibbs that morning, and Bongani Bingwa's show on 702 at that point was playing, and he said, there's been a data hack. It had actually been reported in the Sunday Times the day before, but there's been a data hack. And we're waiting to hear from the CEO, Dave Munro, but clearly he's too busy to speak to 702. And he was quite sort of negative in it. The implication that the CEO was not on the news at 10 to 7. And we went to news. I was still driving. And after that, Bongani said, oh, we've actually got Dave on the phone now. And I never forget Munro's response. He said, I am so sorry that I couldn't join you before. I know you were waiting with me, but I was with the crisis team getting an update and making sure that we're on top of this thing as much as we can be. And that's our first priority. And in doing that, he did two things. He showed that the first response is to minimize harm. What he also did was he was able to take Bingwa's comments, and I'm sure he'd had insight into what he'd say, and reframe back into, we are concerned, we are available to speak, but the reason I'm not speaking to you is because I'm too busy dealing with this crisis. So for me, that was a good lesson in terms of framing. I'll return at Tiger, and you're going to see very small print at the bottom of the page, and that is just a reference, because this is something that I pulled from their website, and I pulled it actually this weekend in thinking about today's presentation. And this is from a press report in Tiger, and I want to just ask you to have a look when I start putting up the commentary here at the sort of sequencing in this press report. So Tiger announced on the 24th of April. This is quite a long time between March, and I don't know the formal testing for listeria, but on the 24th of April, they came out and said that they had received the independent laboratory tests, which confirmed the presence of Listeria 6 in samples of finished ready-to-eat processed meat products. Take a look at McDougall's first comments. His first comment is to say, we are enormously disappointed by this development. We're making every effort to ascertain how it arrived. By now, we've had, I think it's in excess of 250 deaths, despite us adhering strictly to all the prevailing industry standards. We're apologizing. So here comes the apology, a little late. But if you look at it, it's worded as, we don't wholeheartedly apologize. We apologize even as we're trying to determine how it happened. And then he speaks about how we pride ourselves on the food safety standards and a long track record of production and the importance of Tiger brands. And there's no doubt that Tiger has a strong reputation. They were protected. Their branding strategy protected them a little in this because they had a sub-brand, and that was Enterprise, and it wasn't directly the Tiger brand that can help in terms of crisis management, particularly in food crises. But if we look at this, and if we look at the tone and what is being said here, given the seriousness of what played out, I would argue that Tiger Brands did not respond sufficiently. You know, they've come out with the statement quite late, but to start off in your statement by saying that you're deeply disappointed, you should match the response to the crime. There is an argument, and some will say, listen to the lawyers. I would argue that you really need to play this out in the country culture in which you operate. And this is always interesting. One of the crises that we looked at happened in the Ford Motor plant. And when you start looking at how the Americans will deal with crisis, it doesn't always land in the same way in different country cultures, depending on the extent of litigation. We do know that there was a company called, or there is a company called Maple Foods, which is a Canadian company, and it's hard to compare two crises, but they also had an outbreak of listeria giving rise to deaths from listeriosis. They handled it very, very differently to Tiger. They came out and immediately went to a deep, we were at fault, we take this very seriously, a lot of contrition, a lot of an apology. What we saw comparing to the value lost in Tiger, and Tiger, the revenue loss and the profitability loss was significant, but far more, running into the billions, was actually the loss of capital in terms of drops in the share price that it didn't recover from nearly as quickly as a Maple Foods did. So there is a very strong argument, and certainly if you're in the communication game, we would argue, be careful of only listening to the lawyers who sit there and say nothing. There are multiple responses to crisis, and I'm putting up 3 of them now. There are times when you deny, you say this wasn't us. And in fact, if we look at Tiger, what McDougall did to a degree is he said, this is the fault of the system. There's a comment that he made about how this requires a systemic response. It involves everybody who's involved in food production, including regulators, etc. Quite a dangerous thing to do when the fingers are being firmly pointed at your plant. So one has to be pretty careful when you start trying to either deny or diminish. When you diminish, you say, well, it wasn't totally our fault. And a hint here, where something is not as big, and I'm thinking actually about, we don't report it in the book, but I'm thinking about an example that happened around shampoo and a racial incident with Clicks, where they could have pointed finger at Unilever as their suppliers. They could have gone, this wasn't actually our communication, it was a Unilever communication, but they didn't. They actually chose to take it fully on the chin. Now, when you're dealing with Unilever behind you, I guess you think very carefully about when you're going to start blaming your suppliers for things. But typically, if you are at fault, and even if you're not, this rebuild strategy, showing sympathy, apologizing, taking what steps you're going to do to prevent a reoccurrence become really, really important here. So let's just move on a little bit. I wanted to just show an example of the steps that have been taken. And I thought I'd put this up because I know that you're in this game. Tiger Brands took a long time. When we looked at this coming out, it was published, if we have a look, it was a News 24 article published on the 23rd of November to start saying what had happened in the plant and what they'd been doing and the changes that they'd start making. It's too late to start doing that. So speaking about what you're doing to look into this and what you're doing to make sure it never happens again is something that one should do a little earlier. I really am lambasting McDougall, and you know, I don't know him personally. He had a good reputation, good leadership reputation, but unfortunately, when he did his first interview, the headlines also spoke to the way that he engaged as defensive. And that this was what came out in the Times Live with the picture of him. And this leads me to my fourth rule, which is to say, you have to try and be human, but in a constructive way. When you have a crisis happen, the world actually wants to hear from the CEO. If your CEO hasn't actually practiced responding under stress, and it's very dangerous to just send a spokesperson out, we behave differently. Some of us become defensive, some of us become withdrawn. This takes practice. And the dark side of humanity is where we start blustering and where we start saying this wasn't our fault and getting offended by questions. When you've got microphones in your face, it's really hard to be human. It's hard to pause. It's hard to take a breath. It's hard to show that response when you know you're trying to manage a whole lot of disasters behind the scene. But this question of being able to demonstrate genuine concern, to create a sense of legitimacy, if you don't do that, what happens is you start getting a double crisis. There's the crisis, and then you start creating another crisis of leadership, which starts suggesting that you actually can't manage and show that human side, because after all, we're dealing with people. I want to just return quickly to the Liberty story. Where I was quite astounded was I first heard Dave Munro speak on that interview with Bongani Bengwa on the 18th. I counted at least 5 engagements with the media. And, you know, one can argue that there are more important things for a CEO to do, but as much as social media has moved power away from mainstream media, we do turn to mainstream media in a crisis. And so the 5th rule for today is to be accessible to media, is to make sure that when media phones, if you simply give a brusque no comment, you're opening up framing for them. And it might feel like there are more important things to do. But if at all possible, it's actually to leverage that media. And hopefully what you've done is you've built relationships with the media. And that you've been accessible in the past, because once you do that, and once you contact the media and say something's happened, we'd like to speak to you, to actually be proactive. And in certain cases, larger organizations will be working with agencies to do that. But for smaller organizations, I think one of the biggest mistakes that we find made is that people go, no comment, I'm not talking to media. It's an art in itself, how you deal with media, but typically and particularly if you've got a sympathetic spokesperson, being accessible to that media is probably going to strengthen that story. And we've seen amazing turnarounds actually where negative things have happened, but because of the way that media have been handled. Sean Summers years ago in the poisoning crisis with Pick and Pay was just probably one of the best examples, not the easiest man to work with, but when it came to media and being accessible to media, he was quite remarkable. Time is not on my side, and I want to move now, and I'm not going to tell more of the story, but I want to move to that 6th principle. And this is quite broadly, and it's about preempting crisis. If you haven't got strong relationship capital, if you haven't built up the relationship piggy bank, what starts happening with a crisis is you're on the back foot and you're trying to build relationships. And so this importance of actually building a positive brand, having strong relationships and being able to draw on that relationship capital. Remember, I said at the beginning that these are inherently, you might argue, but I would argue they are strong brands. They are good companies. And when we have that, we find that you're far more able to weather a crisis. Just as I start closing, and I hope that there have been some questions posted, I'm not looking at them right now, but I'll come to them in a moment. One of the groups that I think is undervalued in crisis management is employees. Now, your employees are a unique stakeholder group because they are both recipients of your corporate brand, but they are also projectors of your corporate brand. They are your brand. And there is nothing worse than for an employee to read about their employer in media. It's a part of the communication strategy that is often undervalued by agents and our media support. And I would argue that it's really, really important to be taking employees along, because each of those employees, when there's some kind of crisis, and even if you've tied them in with NDAs and they're not allowed to say anything, and you give terse instructions that say you will say no comment if you're asked by anything by anybody, people still go home. They still say things in the bed, at the braai. When somebody says, what do you know about this? And they go, we've been told to say nothing. It doesn't augur well for the organization's reputation. So please don't ignore employees. According to my stopwatch, I have 20 seconds left, which gives me just about enough time to refresh on 6 principles we've spoken about today, about minimizing harm, about responding quickly and conspicuously, about making sure that we respond sufficiently, being human as much as you can, and having to practice that. At the end of the day, this is about relationships, even though we're in a digital world, being accessible to media and valuing those relationships. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to see if there are any questions in the Q&A. And Brandon, I don't see any open questions over here. One of them has been answered, which is, can we have a recording? And yes, you can, absolutely. Brandon, I don't know if there's any questions that you want to ask or any comments that you want to make on that one. And I can't hear you right now.
I'm just going to unmute, sorry. So I've had a few WhatsApps from the audience. I've also had a few emails privately to my inbox, just commending you on your presentation and food for thought. And also obviously requesting a copy of the presentation, which is yes. But I think if I can just say one thing, in my realm of key account manager at Syspro Africa, I think, things aren't always concluded in a day or a minute. Right. And sometimes a crisis happens at a customer, no names mentioned, and, certain parties, whether they're C-level or not, get hold of me or the key account manager for assistance. And obviously there's a process within Syspro, and I'm using an analogy, and they just want communication. Keeping quiet could cause a bigger crisis. So we just, whether it's someone in support that needs to help, someone in CSS, which is in corporate, product management that needs to help, the duration of time doesn't really matter, but knowing that someone's on the issue in terms of a crisis that can appease everybody. And that obviously strengthens the relationship and retains the customer in terms of customer centricity. So, I just want to put things into perspective from a key account management perspective at Syspro Africa. And that I think is one of the successes that we have in Mark Wilson's team, that, communication helps in terms of calming the crisis. But
I couldn't agree more, Brandon. I think, one of the things that if you get your team on call and you turn around, in an ideal situation, you would say that any key customer is going to hear about this from the organization first. They are not going to read about it in the newspaper. Now, with the speed in which responses travel, that's hard. But that kind of thing also takes prior planning. And one can't know what the crisis is going to be. But if one does have a team that's involved in saying who will communicate with who, and that there's some practice in terms of, the empathy, the tone of voice, etc. We don't know anything yet, but we'll keep you informed. We're sure you might be reading. It goes wonders in terms of building trust. And that's what it's all about at the end of the day.
Yes, so it's a really appropriate kind of analogy, putting things into perspective. And I thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you, Nicola, having you as the keynote today. Again, great comments on my WhatsApp and also my private email. I'll share them with you. But again, thank you from the board, the Sugar board. Thank you from Syspro Africa, and obviously from the delegates, the customers and partners for taking the time and just putting, obviously time was not at your fingertips today. And we can obviously elaborate should the need arise. I don't know if there are any other questions that the audience want to ask. We can open up now that we have accommodated time.
I'll dial in a little later. I mean, I would suggest maybe, Brandon, if you want, we can ask Russell to come on, and I'll join a little later if anybody wants to ask anything. How does that sound?
That's great. Thanks, Nicola.
All right. Thank you. Thanks all.
Over to you, Russell.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks, Brendan and Nicola. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Brandon, if you can just confirm that you can see my PowerPoint here.
Yes, thank you. Not yet, just your face at the moment, Russell.
Okay. Sorry about that.
No worries.
I'm sure it's on its way to you, hopefully.
Okay.
If not, let me just redo that. Sorry, that's my mistake.
No worries. There we go. Thank you.
Fingers crossed. Sorry about that. Right. Okay, let's get started. So good day, everyone. And I guess from a cold Johannesburg, it's actually great to see so many people online. So in this session, I'm going to focus on the topic of our web UI or Syspro Avanti, and especially to do with scalability. And I'm going to position the status of our current solution in the field that's been in the field for a number of years, and some new developments have happened recently that you may not be aware of to help provide greater scalability that many of our customers need. I'm also going to spend a bit of time explaining the changes to our architecture. I'm the Chief Software Architect at Syspro, as Brandon mentioned in the intro, so that's close to my heart. And I always think a few diagrams help sometimes position and explain what's going on under the covers. And I'm going to introduce our containerization solution as well. So first, I'm going to position what is Syspro Web UI, what is Avanti, because sometimes there's been some confusion about that. So what is the Syspro Web UI? What is Avanti? What's it about? Well, when Syspro 8 was first developed, and the same with Syspro 7 and Syspro 6 before it, we developed using the Windows desktop rich client to interface to users. That means that the user can use their traditional Windows components to interact with Syspro, and that requires, of course, a Windows desktop to work. So over the past few years, we've developed a new browser interface that we originally called Syspro Avanti. That means sort of moving forward in Italian. And the idea is this is our future of our user interface. And so I'm going to position that a little bit, why we did it and what's it about. So what we've decided to do is call our Syspro Avanti interface our Syspro Web UI. This is really to make it clear that it's a web UI, just another interface to Syspro, just the same as we have our Windows desktop client. The difference is you can use a browser, you can run it over the web, and I also want to mention that behind the web UI, it's still our traditional Syspro components. All our business logic, all our database access, all our transactional logic is exactly the same. And when I get to the diagram, I think that will make it even clearer. So over the past few years, we've created significant documentation and even some product components using the word Avanti, because that was our original sort of code word, if you like, for our web UI. And more recently, we've started to use the word web UI. So if you hear the word web UI or you hear the word Avanti, they're the same things. It's just our browser interface on our traditional Syspro user interface. Okay, so what is web UI containerization? Well, many sites installing Syspro 8 for the first time have been taking advantage of our web UI, which is great. There's lots of reasons why, and we'll get onto some of those. One of the reasons is that you can run Syspro from any device. So whether you've got a phone or a tablet or a Chromebook-like computer that doesn't have a Windows or Mac OS operating system, or it could be a regular computer running a browser such as a Windows or Mac PC. All of those things can use and take advantage of our web UI interface. However, there is a ceiling to the number of concurrent web UI users that we can have on a single application server. So our testing, together with user experience, people who've actually done this and tried it out, have determined that around about 30 to 35 users, you can get poor performance, or you can have seemingly random errors where buttons or certain things don't work as expected. Now, this we discovered middle of last year, and we've now got a new containerization solution that overcomes this limitation. And I'm going to introduce that during this session as well. So in the remainder of the session, I'm going to provide some background and then cover this new solution. So this gets me onto my favorite things, which is onto diagrams. I think it's always nice to have a picture in your mind about what's going on under the covers. So this diagram, the first one, represents our traditional client server architecture. This is where 90 to 95% of our current users are using this architecture. And it shows a single app server in that sort of in the middle there, on the middle left, with a single full Syspro install. And it could be on a host VM, or it could be on, of course, a server without virtualization. I've not shown all the services in this diagram for clarity. The main points are, of course, we've got desktop client users on the top right there. Hopefully you can see that. And those users connect through either terminal server or have individual PCs through a service that's not shown here, straight to what I've called interactive apps. So you can see there's something called full Syspro install, interactive apps, and business objects. So the client users connect through their layer, the communication layer, straight to those interactive apps, which then use the database logic to perform their transactional processing. I've also showed in this diagram the E.NET load balancer, so you can have custom apps that have been developed using E.NET to talk to a load balancer, which also talks to that full Syspro installation with the business objects. And again, you can see that the blocks on the left-hand side are our traditional server-side applications that then interact with the database and managing transactions and returning data. However, from a scalability point of view, although we support only a single app server, we've actually have some sites running huge numbers of volumes of transactions. Some of our sites are running well over 400 plus users concurrently, tens or hundreds of thousands of transactions a day through the E.NET process, showing that we've actually working in our target market effectively for many years. So let's have a look at the web UI or Syspro Avanti architecture. So what I've done, although this diagram looks quite complicated, all I've really done is just at the bottom there, put the web UI channel, if you like, or leg, in addition to what we currently support. So the first thing to notice, of course, is that on the left-hand side, we have our traditional interactive apps, business objects, and the database logic, exactly the same as it was. There is no different logic there. It's actually the same logic. But if we start to the bottom right, we have our web users coming in via our browser using a secure HTML5 channel into our Avanti initialization service. And that then talks to some web UI components that are managing the interaction with the interactive apps on the left-hand side. So you can see it's very similar. The business logic, all the logic that takes account of all the setup options and other customization that may have been performed is all fully there and performing on the left-hand side, including the database transactional logic. However, you will notice that, of course, the difference on that bottom leg is that the web UI is additional. There's some web UI components, which are sitting in that dark blue blob, which is additional information that's running on the app server over and above what we have with our traditional client server or E.NET environment. And it's this environment that is actually limiting the number of users that can run concurrently. So what we found, as I mentioned earlier, is that those web UI components in the dark blue there can limit the number of concurrent users on one app server to around 30 to 35 concurrent users. And you'll find that if you reach that limit, then the system may behave, the performance may be poor, or certain components don't work, sometimes without an error to the user. So what's the solution to that? Let's move on to this. So what we've done is we've built a containerization layer, which helps manage the situation. So what we've done is we create a system where we can have multiple containers that run the web UI components inside them. So inside each of those blue blobs is the web UI components. Notice that on the left-hand side, the interactive apps, business logic, the full Syspro install, and the database logic is exactly the same as before, and as our traditional client server environment. And the stuff on the right-hand side. I'm sorry, we seem to have some. There we go. So on the right-hand side, we've got our web users connecting via browser. They now talk to something new, which is called a Syspro application gateway, which then looks at the least loaded web UI container. So it has a load balancer, just the same as the E.NET load balancer above that we've used now for many years. And that actually looks at which web UI container is least loaded and directs the traffic to that web UI container, which in turn then has a very small component, which then talks to the interactive apps, handling all our normal traditional business logic. The advantage of this containerized solution, and I'm going to drill into it a little bit more in the next slide, is that each one of those web UI containers has some isolation from the other containers. And that means that now we don't have the limits of 30 to 35 users in total. And we've actually had the system running well over 200 users at least one site for 6 months or so, demonstrating this. And I'm going to zoom into that in the next slide. So containers are actually new to most people in the Syspro community that I've dealt with, certainly. And I think about a year and a half, they were very new to me too. So I'm just going to drill into what is a container and how do we ship it and how does this work within Syspro. So this diagram is intended, it's virtually the same as the previous diagram, but just that bottom leg, just showing one container. So again, that dark blue section in the middle there is one container, of which of course you can have many containers running concurrently. So let's delve a little bit more about what that means. So in this diagram, I've shown a single container that will be used to host the web UI components. On a site with a large number of users, you can have as many as 15, 20, or 25 of these containers running concurrently. Now, a container is a bit like a mini virtual machine, but of course, a virtual machine actually uses significant resources on the host app server, whereas a container doesn't. A window container image is extremely efficient and is largely using the same underlying code in the app server itself. The good thing about this is it provides the isolation we need for our Syspro web UI components to work effectively. So what happens when we, what we've done is our developers have created a special web UI container, which is basically just the standard Windows image we have for a container, and we apply configuration changes to it. So a very small number of changes to that container. And then when we deploy it, we dynamically inject parameters into the container, such as the registry entries, so that Syspro, so it understands where the rest of the Syspro install sits. So basically we have a container that we've provided, and as we implement it, then there's certain changes are done dynamically to that container so that the system can work effectively. And the Avanti initialization service is also running within that container so that the Syspro app gateway can communicate with it and direct the traffic appropriately. There's a new setup option to actually define the new application gateway endpoint. And that means that any process within Syspro that needs to query what's going on inside that web container can talk to that Syspro app gateway, and it in turn can talk to each of the containers as applicable. And so it can direct the traffic to the appropriate container, and just the same as a web user coming from outside can also talk to any one of those web containers. Notice that there's still only a single Syspro app server here. There's only a single Syspro instance. We've still got a single base folder, we've still got a single work folder, and all the database logic and so on is still only one instance. That also gives the advantage that any hot fixes or any system upgrades is only still affecting one install. We don't have to install different software or hot fixes across those different containers. So I'm just going to sort of finish off here with some benefits and why have we done this and what we found from implementing this. So the first thing is that the new Syspro application gateway managing the web UI using load balancing on the containers provides the scalability that sites need to take advantage of our Syspro web UI. So we've had many customers who want to take advantage of the web UI, of course, meaning that we don't have to use Windows desktop computers anymore. We can use any device such as a phone, tablet, Chromebook, or any other computer running a browser, which is much easier for administrators to work with and more effective. And because of that, it actually can be much simpler for administrators on a site. So people administering the system have less hassle, keeping all those Windows computers up to date. And of course, it's actually more cost effective because we don't necessarily have to have we don't have to have a terminal server environment, which can be quite expensive. and or PCs for each individual user, that you can actually use a much simpler deployment of the system. And of course, it means there's no software deployed on those client computers, so we don't have to worry about those client server updates, which mostly work automatically, but there's some things that you sometimes have to manage manually. I would also mention at this stage that it could be that the web UI is not appropriate for some, I'm going to call them power users. So for example, if you've ever tried to use Excel in a browser, you'll know that it does work and it's useful for querying spreadsheets and working with it. But if you're a power user, it can be better to use a desktop app. So there are cases where people prefer to use the desktop client environment, but for new users, for novice users, or occasional users, the web UI is perfectly adequate and very effective. And on top of that, it does have the vast majority of the functionality from our normal traditional client-server interface. So one of the questions I've been asked also with this is, when can I have it? Well, the answer is right now. So that's the good thing about doing this presentation today. During mid-2022, we actually validated the solution at scale. I'm going to say this was the biggest validation effort that we've ever put in our Syspro development team to provide automated testing at scale for this solution to ensure that it's robust and reliable. And I'm pleased to say that we're completely confident that this solution is working as expected. We deployed this in our Syspro 8 2022 release. As Brandon mentioned, we released that earlier this year. I think it was in February. But we've also retrofitted this logic into the previous release, which was launched in 2021, the 2021 R2 release. So it is also available on that version. As an example, we have one customer who was desperate for this change, and where they implemented it during December, early December, over that busy Christmas period for them. And it's been working extremely successfully since then, which is great to hear. And it really backs up the testing and validation that we performed during mid last year. The other thing to notice is that because we're deploying multiple containers, then we recommend that you use Windows Server 2022 Data Center Edition. Although that's more expensive than the other editions, there is, on the other editions, there's a cost per container with Windows. Whereas the data center edition, there's no cost per container, and therefore scaling out 15, 20 or plus containers is sometimes more effective. And of course, that depends on a license agreement you have with Microsoft. So I just want to mention that. You have to be on Windows Server 2022, and ideally the data center edition. And finally, well, I hope you found that this information about the web UI, a bit about the history and Syspro Avanti, and this exciting new web application gateway that we've released towards the end of last year and made available in the 2021 R2 release. There is a lot of information about this because it's new to most people. So there's a lot of information that we've produced that's available on our Syspro help site. That includes a great overview of it and details about how to install and configure it, because that's very important that that's set up appropriately, and a lot of troubleshooting hints and tips that we've learned over this last year or so while we've been developing and deploying the solution. If you've got any other questions about the web UI or Avanti scalability, you can reach out to one of the Syspro service teams, and I'm sure they'll be glad to help. And if they have a problem, then they'll always forward it onto my team to support them. So that's wrapping up today. Hopefully you found that useful and interesting. And next up is going to be Simon Conradi and Franz Schumann talking about the inventory optimization and the cloud.
Russell, before you go, we do have 5 questions for you. If you could stay till the end, where we can answer those in the QA, if you don't mind.
Absolutely, of course I will.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks so much.
Good, thank you. Thanks for that, Russell. And just check, is my partner in crime, Simon Conradi, there?
Yes, I'm here.
Great.
Hi, Franz.
Hi there, Simon. Let me just share screen quickly, and let's get that rolling. And I'm hoping that the inventory optimization slideshow is upon us. Has it come through on your side, Simon?
Yes, it's showing well. Thank you. Thank you, Franz.
Fantastic. All right. Well, once again, thanks for joining us, Simon. And let's jump right in and let's start talking about inventory optimization. And obviously, you've deployed the inventory optimization modules a number of times, and let's just talk a little bit about why we actually built it in the first place. What is the problem we're trying to solve?
That's a great place to start, Frans. And that's why we've got this slide, which is why do we have inventory in the first place? And we've got there the first two blocks on the left, uncertainties in demand and uncertainties in supply. Now, in fact, we can embrace in that the whole idea of VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Those are the reasons why we have inventory. So that inventory, as the bottom picture shows, is the buffer between that host of uncertainties on the supply side and that host of uncertainties on the demand side. That's the main reason. Those other four things, the lead time, the demand and supply quantity is not equal, the limitations on order frequency and the need for higher service levels, just adds to the complexity and the need to have a structured and coherent way of approaching how you manage, how you get and manage and deal with inventory. So that's the causes of inventory. And then we need to then look at why, because obviously we know, as everybody knows, that inventory is often the biggest or one of the biggest items on the balance sheet. It's how you make your customers happy in many industries and many businesses. So it's an extremely important part of the business consideration, the business landscape. So now we have to understand a little bit more about how we then can optimize inventory and get it to work properly for us. So in that, we have four simple questions. Obviously, these questions can be very deep, but we try to keep it down to four simple questions, and so that we can contextualize what has to be done. And the four questions are, as you see there, what is the nature of the stock code to be managed? How important is it? How does it behave? Where does it fit in the whole hierarchy of stock codes that we might be dealing with? Where is it in its life cycle? All of those questions live in that block there. Then the second one, the orange one, is how much will we sell? In other words, what is the demand for that item? And there are multiple approaches to answering that question as well. And the third question is the one that probably isn't given as much attention as it should. And that is, how much should we stock? And that one plays very much into that first slide. What are the parameters around that stock code, which will then drive what the stock level for that particular stock code should be? And we want to emphasize, as you know, Frans, this is a very dynamic situation. Different stock codes behave differently within the same family. Within different regions, the same stock code can behave differently. For different customers, it can behave differently. So this is often a very complex and difficult question to answer. And if we get those three right, or we manage those as well as we can, that last question, which is how much must we make or buy, actually becomes relatively simple. We can get those first three to work properly, then the last one, which is usually the one where people focus, how much must we make or buy, those three feed into that and make that process much more transparent, visible, and simpler to achieve. So maybe now we can look at what the steps are to address those questions. And I know that after this, we're going to start looking at where these play out in Syspro. So the first one, to address the importance of the stock code, is to understand what kind of stock code are we dealing with, is to understand the importance and the behavior of the stock codes at each location. And a very key element of this is the Pareto analysis, which that little graphic shows. We're all familiar with the ABC analysis, which is the 80-20 rule, named after the Italian mathematician Pareto, who first postulated it. And that's a very important consideration. And this we can do in many dimensions. We can do it in the dimension of sales value. We can do it in the dimension of cost or profit, or the quantity.
Sorry, Simon, I wonder if I shouldn't go into just that slide in a little bit more detail. So if we're talking about that detail, that we kind of talk in reference of the particular slide. Good idea. Okay with that?
Yeah, perfect. That's great. And you're going to show this in Syspro shortly. Anyway.
Absolutely.
So here we see that this is not an 80-20 particular segment. And this is from an Australian company that we worked with last year for a training on IO in the Asia Pacific area. And there they had 8% of their items were giving them 80% of their sales value. So it's a very skewed situation. And you'll see that the tail, which is the C and the D items, are giving 53% of the items are only giving them 2% of their revenue, and 18% of their items, the C items, are giving them 3% of their revenue. So it's a very skewed situation. And this is often what we're dealing with. And here we're looking at only the sales value ranking. But as you know, within Syspro, we can rank it in those 5 or 6 dimensions I mentioned earlier. So maybe we can go back to the previous slide now and just quickly talk through those, and then we'll. So then the second step is to get the best possible estimate of demand. That could be a forecast. And for those who are familiar with demand-driven approach, and there's some of your Syspro customers are actually using the DDMRP approach within Syspro that are on this call. So we've got the ADU, which is the average daily usage, or the APU, which is the average planning usage, which is another way of saying the forecast, but it's put into a different context. Or we might blend those things together. So you're trying to get what is the customer going to be taking? What is the real demand that we're going to be getting? We're going to get a best estimate of that. Then the third step is.
Sorry, I wonder if I think what might be useful is that if we just look first and just look at the Pareto step, and then let's get into a little bit more detail on each one of these other steps.
Okay.
I'm just
Great
worried
idea.
that we if we lose the thread around the Pareto, it drives so much more of the discussion. So let's look in a little bit more detail on that Pareto. And then that'll naturally lead us into the kind of forecasting discussion. So if I go into Syspro and let me know if my Syspro screen has come through on yours. Great. Let's just touch a little bit on that Pareto, because I think there's a bit of complexity in this, in that when we look at a Pareto, we typically want to look at it in how we do that selection. In its broadest sense, the Pareto is a selection of all my saleable items, and we can do the classification here and if they're made in or bought out, but typically it's my saleable items, and saying, well, I want to look at it across sales value. But there are very kind of critical subsets of this as well, and saying, well, maybe Pareto in a certain environment is not defined by the sales value. It might be defined more by their gross profit contribution. So we've got a number of customers who look very closely at and rank their products by their profit contribution. And they can also then be done by cost quantity or hits, or how many times the item has been invoiced. But then there are obviously subsets to this which become very important, and some that are sometimes overlooked are when we do subsets by supplier, for example, and wanting to look at items that we procure from a particular supplier, and then looking and ranking their importance by the Pareto metric. So I'm just going to run this for all of my items by sales value, just to give you a feeling of what that looks like. So the system then compiles a ranking of these items, and we can then get a fairly good feel on what we're looking at here. So the Pareto analysis here, and let me just get a little bit more real estate going. And Russell has obviously spoken a little bit about the Avanti interface, and I'm giving you a little bit of a sneak into that now and saying, okay, well, let's look at what that is. And we've got the quantity of items that we've sold. We've got their cost, the sales value, the profit, the on-hand value, and the total number of items. And we can see that very clearly here. Our A items, which are giving us the 80% of our sales value, and the on-hand value of around 3 million in stock. And if we then scroll down this list, we then eventually get to our E items, which we have not sold, and we're sitting with 17 million. And that's also one of the key metrics in saying, well, what is my holding cost of these items? And saying, does the holding cost equate to the value that I'm deriving from a turnover point of view? And the lower we go in that ranking, it becomes extremely visible in this type of Pareto analysis of what holding these 650 stock codes is costing me from a working capital point of view, and the low return I'm getting on that working capital. So that's another issue that's handled very clearly in a Pareto analysis. And then from the Pareto analysis, Simon, I think then it leads us naturally into saying, okay, well, if I have these 11 items that are giving me 80% of my turnover, you know, what do these items look like? And let's be very much more specific in these 11 items on how we're going to determine what that future demand looks like and how we're going to stock these items. So I'll go back quickly to our PowerPoint, and then we can look at the kind of forecasting side of it, which is really saying we've identified the item. Now, what do we do with it?
Great, thanks, Frans. And that is the next important question. What is the demand for this item? So what we just wanted to illustrate quickly, because you may or may not know, but much of the planning for supply chain around the world and in big and small companies is done with Excel. And the favorite approach is look at the last average 6 months of sales and see what we've got. And what this slide is showing is that there we have a product with seasonality, and seasonality exists in all industries around the world. You'll find seasonality, sometimes in the strangest places. Seasonality means exactly what the graphic shows, that it's higher at some times of the year and lower at other times of the year. And if you're forecasting with an average, which is that dotted green line in the middle, you've got something which is a forecast, which is half of the average demand at some points, which is the minimum demand, is half of the average. And sometimes at the maximum levels, it's double the average demand. So that means you'll be forecasting most of the time incorrectly, because you're forecasting for an average which never really exists. You can see it's either below that or above that. Now, if we look at the next slide, we can see what the effect is. And you can see the dotted lines, which is showing how the green line is the average forecast, the blue is the minimum, and the light blue is the maximum, and the dark blue is the minimum. Now, we're now doing a forecast that is much closer to what the actual demand pattern is. And we can then make sure that we've got stock and we've got stock holding that is meeting that actual forecast. So the ability to do a seasonal forecast is extremely important. So Francis, maybe you could show in Avanti how that looks.
Let's have a look. Let's have a look. Has my screen come through?
Screen is shown up, yes.
Fantastic. And let's go and look at the manual forecasting. And bit of a misnomer calling it a manual forecast. But what we're doing here is that we're having a look at an item in isolation. And as Simon said, one of the key issues here is that these items behave very differently depending on where they are. So in a particular location, this product might behave very differently, and it would have a very different demand pattern in that location. So the item I'm looking at here, and I'll just shrink that to give me a better graphic, is to say, let's look at how it behaves in this location. And we can see that I'm looking at some historical data. So I'm looking at a couple of years of historical data, and they're plotting graphically. But if I wanted to look at that in data terms, I would look at it in the following way and saying, I now have my years of sales history. So there are a couple of things that are happening. You can see that I have got a growth trend in this particular, for this item in this location, as well as a very pronounced seasonal curve. So the seasonal curve needs to be extrapolated over the growth trend. So if I'm seeing a growth trend, the system is suggesting then that we increase the sales according to the trend, but not evenly. We increase them over the seasonal curve. So that's managed for me automatically. And what I've plotted here as well is the mean demand, and you can see how wrong you would get it. And, you know, the Spero thought in the old days where we could basically have one stock level, or one minimum, one maximum level, you know, per warehouse in Syspro, where we could not track that movement and apportion the forecast seasonally. So this is a very kind of powerful tool in us avoiding the obvious trap here of being overstocked out of season and woefully understocked in season. And then there's a lot of complexity behind this around you know, setting up different algorithms and looking at these algorithms, and they may behave differently. So if I have a moving average algorithm, how many months do I want to use it for? And so my different algorithms are enabled from this particular stock code, this location. How do I want to set this up? And getting into the details of exactly how I want to weight my period averages, etc. So there's a lot of detail in here, and I think technically, you know, instead of doing this in Excel, what's very nice here is that we can access the actual sales history data as well, and look at the sales history data and saying, okay, well, let's have a look at the actual sales history data and go and maintain some of that data, and saying, well, we've obviously got a problem in that month. It looks a bit weird. We could actually go and maintain and do adjustments from a forecasting point of view without impacting any of our actual sales transactions. We can just exclude them from the calculation, which makes it a very powerful tool that is enabled in Syspro for us to be able to manage that kind of forward look and putting this into a graphical term, and us being able to have an understanding of what this demand looks like. I think that gives us a good idea of a possible future, what the possible future looks like, but it's definitely not the whole story. So I'm going to hand back over to you.
Just a quick point at this, and that is, you might look at all those algorithms or forecast models and your eyes might glaze over, but actually Syspro has some intelligence built into it, in that it will select the best one for you. You can go into a mode which we call competition, where Syspro then says, okay, looking at this patterns in this data, this is the one I suggest. And it will come up in many cases with, and their Francis is showing it to you, it'll come up with, if there's good seasonality in it, which means it's got a shape like that, then it will come up with a seasonal algorithm rather than limit you to just some kind of averaging calculation.
I often refer to that as like forecasting for dummies. Because it does exactly that. It goes and looks at all the available algorithms and determines which one would have the lowest tracking error, as it were, when compared to the actual sales. Okay, Simon, I think the clock is chasing us, so let's go back to our story. And now let's talk about stock levels.
Yes, and as you implied earlier, if we've got a seasonal pattern, we want to have seasonal stock levels. We want to stock up in the high season and stock down in the low season. And so this is what you can do within the stock modeling capability. You can decide, the little smiley face is your service level. You want the customer to be happy, so you want to smile there. But you also want to balance that against the cost of holding that inventory, which you mentioned earlier. So the yellow line is the maximum stock we're going to hold. The green line is an indication of the forecast that we're expecting. And the red line is the minimum stock we might hold according to the policy. Now, we might flex those. We can run different scenarios, or we can try different service levels. So if we can just click on it and the graphic will move for us. And we might then get lower stock levels and less inventory investment, but we're not getting acceptable service levels. So this capability exists in the stock modeling capability. We can find what is the optimal balance between service and cost of stock. And one more click will take us back to a better scenario where we've got both a lower cost of stock holding and an acceptable level of service within the parameters of the stock code. So let's have a look at that one now inside Syspro.
Great, let's have a look here. And more appropriately named is the stock levels modeling program. And once again, it's location specific. And we're now going to load up a fairly complex model on a number of different elements. And so it takes a system a second to collate the data that it's wanting to model on. So it now picks up all the historical demand, picks up the forecast, it picks up the current stock levels, it'll pick up the any outstanding purchase orders, any future sales orders that we might have, and it will then run that model across the time periods that we have defined. So give that a second to load up, and I'm wondering if I'm actually got the right data location here. So give me 1 second, Simon.
Just tab off that.
Yep, sorry, let me just go on to sorry, I've got the different location. Let me just.
And as you say, that stock model is actually simulating the whole supply demand situation.
Yeah.
Both now into the future. So it is a complex set of calculations that are lying underneath that, hopefully made simple and visible.
100%. Okay, let that load up. So what we see here is the fact that we've got my company date is sitting on the 1st of April. So what we can see here is that I've got an opening stock level. I then have my existing supply and existing demand, which in this case is sales on book, but I have it in the current as well as any future supply and demand. So the system takes that all into consideration. I then have a forecast. We now know where the forecast comes from. And we then go and see the fact that if I do quick math here, that I've got 1,900 plus 400 odd, and let's call that 2,500 of supply. I've got a demand of 966, and you might say to yourself, well, that is more than sufficient to supply my sales demand. Why is the system suggesting that I add additional stock to that current available stock? And it's this exact issue that you're talking about, Simon, is saying, well, how much cover have I chosen to keep of this particular item? How much variability and what kind of service level do I want to offer my customers on this item? And that's driven me in this case to place a very big buffer of stock. And the system has said, right, well, if you want 90 odd days of cover, then the min-max that you require to hold is of that quantum. So this it makes it very clear the cost of holding stock because of that min-max that we see there. And the system is, and you know, it goes without saying that what we're looking for the system to do is to monitor the stock level as soon as it drops below minimum, is to buffer it up to maximum. And we can see that very clearly in graphically what's happening, as well as the fact that the system is dynamically resizing that min-max based on the seasonality. So my buffer size is changing based on the seasonality. I've chosen quite an extreme cover setting here, but let's be a little bit more modest on that, Simon. Let's go into the policy setting and go and say, well, if I look at a policy which is currently active, let's change that slightly and go and say, I want to make that policy, slightly less generous, and saying, let's move that down to maybe a 30-day cover. What I also could have done is targeted a certain service level. And then your service level targeting is a little bit more dynamic and less structured, in that it'll go and monitor my on-time in full performance, and it will then go and look at that on-time in full order fill rate and how well I've performed historically, and then set a buffer accordingly. But I'm going to take a far more simplistic approach here and just set it down to a 30 days a buffer stock level, and saying, well, we only want 30 days, and let's go and remodel the min-max just on a different day's cover. And there you can see the min-max is brought right down. You can see that I now no longer need to replenish my stock. If I'm only going to hold 30 days, I'm good with stock until the beginning of my seasonal peak demand, where I'm going to need to procure or manufacture additional stock over that period. So it gives us a sense of the system's ability to manage and allow us a very good control over how much stock we want to keep in this particular location. And what I've done manually here for a single item, we can obviously do in batch selection for multiple items. Great, Simon. Anything you want to add to that?
That was great, Frans. I think we need to move on. I think we're running to the limit of our time. So we just need to then talk a little bit about the last step, which is done by MRP. And so we haven't got a graphic for that. But as we said before, if this all feeds in, what we saw on that stock modeling screen is basically what MRP is going to tell us. That stock modeling screen is really replicating exactly what MRP is going to tell us. So you have at a glance a picture of what MRP is going to say. It's just the ability within MRP to then create that job or those purchase orders to make sure the supply is there to meet that demand.
100%. And Simon, those are the typical MRP outputs based on that, where we have either a purchasing output, we'd have a making output of a job, or we might have an output for a supply chain replenishment. If we've got warehouse dependency where certain subsidiary warehouses are supplied out of a distribution center, that might be a viable output as well. So those are the typical MRP outputs once I've completed the planning.
Exactly.
Great, Simon, thank you so much. I think it's a great summary of the capabilities in the tool. What I think I'm going to do at this point is just hand over to Gerard from RCL. Gerard, are you standing by on your side?
Before we hand over to Gerard, thank you, Frans and Simon. I think we have also 3 or 4 questions for you, so if you could stay on to the end as well, Frans.
Sure thing.
Do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frans and Simon, for an insightful presentation. And thank you, Brandon, for the opportunity to share our story. So good morning to everybody. Might not be as interesting as you've just seen, but let's hope we can share our story and inspire some others with their own journeys. So I'm going to share my screen and just run my presentation. Right. Are you seeing my screen? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Good. So RCL Foods Milling Division, our story, so our journey with the Syspro professional services and key account management. So let's just jump right into the agenda. I'm just going to give a brief company background of who we are as RCL Foods, as a broader group. Just share quickly or shortly our project timeline, how we got to where we ended up. Sharing our project organization, how we structured the resources within our project with professional services and with the support of the key account management, how we manage that relationship throughout the process. Of course, there were some wins, challenges and opportunities, and then also what is the way forward for RCL Foods and Syspro, and then we will leave some time for Q&A. So, right, so just a brief company background. RCL Foods is a JSE listed leading South African food manufacturer. We employ over 21,000 people. We produce a wide range of branded, private, and private label food products, which we predominantly, or a big part, supply through Vector Logistics. Yeah, our strategy is founded on a clear sense of who we are and we want to be as a business. So food is our business. We have clear guidelines in terms of the way of doing things, our passion, what we want to do, and how we want to see ourselves by our customers and our clients. So below, I've just listed some of the brands that RCL represents. So and then if we can quickly look into our ERP footprint, which is of relevance for today. We have about 106 Syspro 8 concurrent licenses, which is in the milling operating unit, of which a big part of today's presentation will deal. And in addition to that, we have about roughly 150 E.net licenses for third-party integration into Syspro, mostly for RightScan and also some for business objects and integration layers. We have also in our other operating units, we have 7 bakeries where we have 190 operating on 190 Syspro 7 concurrent licenses. We also have Syspro 7 operating a grocery, and then all other business units is running SAP on a RCL group template. So if we look at our journey, specifically now for the milling operating unit, our journey from Syspro 6.1 to Syspro, with some interesting journeys or activities in between. So if you look at the broad project timeline for milling, our journey started. We were on Syspro 6.1 for many years, and we knew there was a need for change around 2008 and 2019, and there already some of the earlier discussions were taking place with Syspro key account management team in terms of the need for change. And so there was a lot of informal discussions around July 2020, or just prior to that. We decided, well, we really need to move along with our ERP journey, and then we signed off a business blueprint, and the selection at that time was to be integrated in the group SAP template. And then that project kicked off in September 2020. That went on, and soon we realized, in terms of we had opportunity to really realize, the functionality, what we will get, and what opportunities and challenges there might be. So around March, there was some other priority projects. So our SAP project took a production break, or a project break. That allowed us to just reflect in terms of where we are and where we expect to be. And from that perspective, a big gap in the template at the time was the visibility from a working process perspective. So we at milling, we have a good infrastructure for PLCs and SCADA, and we really wanted to have a visibility of that process in our ERP. So in May 2021, the SAP project was placed on hold. Between March and May, we actually explored with the professional services team and also the key account management team. We explored within that break, what would the working process blueprint look like in a Syspro environment or Syspro 8 environment. So we took that time, spent some productive time, evaluate different scenarios, and we actually went through several iterations of working process. So from that perspective, we reviewed what we had in our SAP roadmap, and versus what fit for purpose alternatives we wanted, and with the knowledge of our working process would look like within the ERP. And between May and August, we really engaged with the RCL executive team, trying to motivate why it is a need for something else. And then around August 2021, Syspro 8 was selected as the ERP replacement, where after we kicked off the project, there was a non-negotiable timeline. We had to go live with the project in July 2022, which was a hard stop, and that was one of the primary conditions for allowing the process. What really motivated the final decision was really the end-to-end process visibility from our SCADA PLCs, or working process, our Weybridge operations, and also warehouse management scanning integration. That was quite a critical consideration, and it had to remain within the timeline and within the original budget. And having this additional scope within Syspro 8 actually allowed us these additional functionalities, which we originally would not have had with our Syspro, our SAP roadmap. Quickly looking at the project organization, how we structured between business and Syspro. Obviously, we had our own project team within RCL Foods, with a lot of support from our group process support, like master data. And then we had full-time functional SMEs, subject matter experts assigned to the project because of the tight deadline and the timeline we had to complete the project. And then as a result, we also on a needed basis, we got some external functional subject matter experts to support the RCL Foods team. Within Syspro, we on the professional services side, we had project manager. There were some technical and functional consultants, and at some stage where necessary, especially at some stage with master data and with some of the mapping of the business processes, the professional team, there was a lot of the load work was very high, and they made use of some of their external partners, or some within their partner network. They assigned some resources to ensure we stayed on track with our timeline. That all overseen by the steering committee, which was a joint executive team from RCL Foods, Syspro Key Account Management, and also professional services. So it was a tight team and really involved team, especially from the executive team. Within how did we manage those relationships? If we look at some wins, there was full executive leadership commitment with a full scope and unlimited project lead time from both RCL Foods and Syspro. Response was excellent, and we really, when we experienced a crisis looming, the response time and the support from both executive teams were really good, and it was exceptional. The wins for us to follow the process of starting the process with a business blueprint, that development and alignment made the project deliverables very clear. It was a very important part of the process for us. Syspro Professional Services and Key Account Management, appointing Syspro as our single point of contact and accountability, and it was one of the attractive points for us to follow the key account and professional services route, because the response times are very quick, and we had a single point of contact in case there was problems and issues. And then whenever there was a requirement, the Syspro team involved some of their partners in the process to, like I said earlier, to make sure we could keep our we could stick to our timeline. And I think in the end, a big win within Syspro 8, we got a lot more functionality for our investment. So we stayed within the timeline and within the budget, and for that, in Syspro 8 we got a lot of additional functionality which we originally would not have had, which was great. Challenges, there was some accelerated learning of external resources in terms of getting to know our business within a limited time frame. So there was not a lot of time to try to understand the business process. The whole team, when we started the project, had to hit the road running. And also one challenge, which initially a challenge, but eventually a win, was managing youth versus experience. So our team was quite diverse in terms of youth and experience. And in the end, there was a slow start maybe from the youth, but I think in the end they were the ones that, because they were fast learners, they really assisted with the acceleration of achieving the deliverables of the project. So and I think the experience that people were very willing to take them on board and share their experience with them. So for me, that was initially a challenge, but in the end was quite a great initiative. Opportunities which we learned from the process. If you get stuck, don't delay. A big part of this project still happened within COVID-19 restrictions. But later on in the project, especially like, for instance, as an example, master data, at some stage we ran into a challenge. And when we got the team together, sitting face to face and discussing with partners and Syspro resources, it really had a great impact on the project. And I think another opportunity, if we had probably a bit longer time at our disposal for the project, we probably would have gotten a bit deeper into the detail, because there was some surprises and assumptions when we started the project, which later on we got to know what it really was. And so the more detail, the better, as a future learning. To close off in terms of the way forward for RCL Foods, 2023-2024 financial year, we have 7 baking operations and 1 grocery operating units. They need to migrate from Syspro 7 to Syspro 8, which is going to be a big task in the next 12 months. For 2024 and beyond, might consider also a working process in the replenishment planning in baking and grocery, and then also exploring all the nice artificial intelligence tools and other new value-adding technologies which could assist our business. And I think in closing, RCL, as RCL Foods, we found value in the key account and professional services Syspro offered. It, like I mentioned earlier, it provided us with a single point of contact and accountability. For sure, there is a place for Syspro partners, and we used through our Syspro single point of contact. They did extend some work to partners, especially for expert services like integration services and other industry-related applications and functionalities. And they also remained a valuable extended resource for Syspro. We had a big bulk of work to be done at a certain stage of the project, for which there were no in-house resources or sufficient in-house resources. And Syspro tapping into their partner network really assisted us in getting the additional resources to deliver those objectives within time. So in a nutshell, that is who and what we are. I will close the presentation, and I'm not sure if there's any questions. We can go into the Q&A now.
I think let's leave the Q&A for the end, Farah. But really thank you again for your really meaningful presentation and the great journey that we followed with you and Willem and Donal and the team. And we'll take up the rest later. Thank you again.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Brandon. And then I'll hand over to Emilia from Imperium and Wesley from Blue Mining for their presentation.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Emilia. If anybody guessed, and this is Wesley.
I'm Wesley.
We are going to have a very informal session regarding the implementation and the decisions that was made during the implementation and how it affected the business as well as everybody around us. So I'm going to firstly ask Wesley to explain to us the complexity of their business and what exactly it is that they do.
Okay, so we are Blue Mining Services. We're a group of companies. We're contract miners that mine coal, underground mining. We have 5 companies within our group. We have SBS, which is in Dorsfontein West, Botshabelo, which is in Dorsfontein East, for Zando South, which is in Bethel area. And then we have our new project, CMS Alpha, which is in Reedspread. And then we have our head office here in Middleburg in Mpumalanga. Yeah, so we work on a rand per ton basis. So cost is really important to us. So we like to keep our costs quite low to maximize profitability.
Okay, so Wesley, in 2022, you decided to embark on the road of ERP. How did you used to do your business, and what led you to embark on this road?
So the business was run quite well. It was a bit smaller. It was run mainly on Excel, and then we used Pastel Partner, which was still on a pervasive system. So it was very basic. Very manual. So as we started growing, we realized that we needed to get a ERP solution in order to ensure that we kept the accuracy and of all of our information in one space, because we also have to report to the DMR a lot. So when we have one source of truth, it just made it a lot easier. And with the ERP system, we can ensure that that is what we have.
How many ERPs did you explore?
Well, we did quite a few. We did probably about 4 or 5 different ERPs solutions. They all came here to the head office. We had interviews with them. We sat down, discussed the different solutions that we wanted between the procurement and the financial department. And eventually we decided on Syspro because it ticked most of the boxes that we were looking for.
These boxes that you were ticking.
So once Syspro, we decided on Syspro, we got referred to Imperium Consultants, which is you. We then invited you for a meeting with us. And upon meeting you, the decision became quite easy to stick with Syspro, because you highlighted the customability of Syspro and how we could make it and integrate it that it was purely for our business needs, exactly how we wanted it. Your custom form fields, the way you like to use it. So your passion and your knowledge of Syspro and of the mining industry just led us to know that this was a very good fit for us going forward.
Okay, since you embarked on this journey, you obviously, like you said, you interviewed a lot of other vendors as well. Since the demonstration that you received on Syspro, how long did it take you as an organization and the steering committee to come to the conclusion that Syspro is the way to go?
So like I said earlier, upon meeting you, the decision didn't really become too difficult. So we had an internal discussion, and probably a week later we were ready and decided to buy the license and go ahead with you and start our implementation process.
Okay.
Yeah, it was good. It was quick.
Yeah, it was. It was really a very quick decision that you made. Okay, so Wesley, tell me something. The change management, obviously, there was a lot of role players involved. It's not only the management, it's not only the finance people, it's not only the procurement team, but there's a lot of other operators being in the mining industry that's also involved in the processes that we implemented. What was the approach that we followed to get to the end result?
So obviously we first created a plan, and because of the way we used to work, where everything was completely manual, we had to take that into consideration, because a lot of the employees that work on the mine have been so used to doing it for a certain way for such a long time. That became a very interesting, I guess, buy-in that we had to get from the people. So we didn't completely change the whole system and make it automated. We kept certain parts manual to not disrupt that system, and then other parts we made automated. So together we worked, we did all 5 sites pretty quickly. So we divided and conquered with your team and our team, and we did a road show where we went through to all the different sites and explained to the managers and the key stakeholders what would happen and how it would happen. One of the things that made it a lot easier was Avanti. So Avanti, you just need, like Russell said, a laptop and a internet connection, and it becomes a lot easier. So with that, we also enabled a lot of users that had never been using an ERP system to use it. So the nice thing about Avanti was that we could also customize the the screens that they opened based on role. So it became a lot more user-friendly where no one had to navigate. As soon as you logged in, it was already exactly what you needed to do for that role. And people just carried on. So the learning curve wasn't actually that huge. It was quite easy, and the buying became good. Yeah.
Since the incision of the implementation, there was a process that we followed. We obviously first interrogated for lack of a better word, to find out exactly what your business processes are and how we can apply Syspro to that.
Yeah.
Okay. We then came up with your blueprint. And we came up also with the implementation plan.
Yeah.
And inside this implementation plan, we covered a lot of aspects. We covered the training, we covered the user acceptance testing, and not only did we change your system, but we also changed your whole your whole chart of accounts.
Yeah.
We took on 2 years worth of outstanding purchase orders.
Yeah, exactly. And we redid all of the suppliers. We did a whole bunch of big undertaking to basically the whole system we have with Pastel, we redesigned and put it onto Syspro to completely meet our needs, and then allocate costs a lot more effectively so that we could really know in which sections cost was coming from.
And we're also using one single supplier database, basically.
Yes.
That we roll out to all the different companies.
Yeah, so we use one database, which we put in the master file, and then with the click of a button, I can roll it out to 2, 3, or all companies that I need to if I use that company on different sites.
And you were mentioning the DMR requirements.
Yeah.
So we did a lot of customization.
Yes.
And we also added a lot of additional fields to be able to accurately report on your procurement spend, because your procurement spend is rather peculiar.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us about your procurement spend?
With the procurement spend, it's really based on, so with the BBBEE, it's based on locality and the area that we buy from. So if the mine is operating in Creel, we have to really look at the Creel area and support that community and grow that community. So what Syspro has allowed us to do is whenever we create a supplier, I can put all the BE information, including locality, municipality, and we can go completely down. We can really break it down with those custom forward fields. So I can see exactly where my spend is in any area at any point of time. And one of the big drives we have now is to increase that BBBEE database so that we can have that accurately. And then when reporting comes out, it's really just a click of a button, and then we have all that information.
And working with the compliance, there's also documents that you need to store.
Yes.
Do you receive those documents and put it in a file?
Well, what we're slowly doing now is, with the help of you and Lawrence, the developer husband, is we have now on Syspro, we're adding attachments directly onto the system. So we're trying to go paperless as well, where everything we can just save directly on to the system. So if it's a supplier, all the information is based on that supplier. If it's an order, all the GRNs and quotes and stuff is right there. Accessing exactly.
And it also makes auditing a lot easier because all the information is locally stored.
Exactly.
So it wasn't all wasn't moonshine and roses. What are some of the challenges we faced?
So obviously the biggest challenge was people getting the buy-in from guys who've been on the mine that have been doing the same thing for 10 to 20 years, to get them to change and try and sit in front of a computer and create, read a report or create an RTO, which was challenging within itself, but we got around it. The second challenge was load shedding, and because we'd been doing things so manually, when we got our bare metal server, the load shedding really affected us. So what we had to do is, with the help of Imperium, we moved our whole database onto the cloud, and that way we were able to install an inverter, get a new server that's completely dedicated to Syspro, and then was able to put it back there and run that completely. So now that runs smoothly in its own isolated.
Without any disruption to
normal. No disruption. Well, we started our implementation on the 30th of June and we went live on the 5th of August. So it was a really quick time. And within that time, there was almost no disruption to business. There were 1 or 2 hiccups, but we managed to get around it with the help of you guys and get it done.
Thank you, Wesley. You say the nicest things. So in conclusion, Wesley, where are we currently and what is the road ahead?
So Syspro has definitely freed up a lot of space for people to start doing more value-added work, especially with removing a lot of the manual aspects. There's obviously less printing because we have that feature that we are starting to attach all the documents on. We have a big advantage to Syspro is because it's on the SQL database. We can now integrate. We're using Zap BI, so we're now integrating more BI reporting, which allows us to see all the information that is in Syspro to come out in a graphical form or something like that. So it's a lot more visual to see. So our reporting and our understanding of our business is going to become a lot better as well. And then as time has gone on, we're slowly building trust with the users of the system, which is really becoming very nice.
And all the different business units.
Exactly.
So would you, I don't want to say in conclusion again, but would you say that Syspro, one of the advantages of implementing Syspro is the absolute transparency?
Exactly. No, it is, because that's one of the other great things. One of the big decision factors was that there's a stamp, what do you call it, on every transaction. You can see who it was done by what time and it was done, so the other job log. So that was a big requirement for the finance team, and with that we've been able to do delegation of authority and different roles. So yeah, it's really improved our organization.
And the last thing, the month-end processes. I know in the beginning, you guys with the creditors, you used to take another week to capture creditors, and only once the creditors was done, like on the 10th, the finance team would start their month-end.
Yeah.
How did this process improve, if it did?
Oh no, it improved dramatically. So like, I think yesterday we did a run and it took 15 minutes. We had the run and then the creditors can carry on with their whatever they need to do. So that's improved and saved us a lot of time, definitely. So awesome. Yeah, so with the help of you and I mean your on-site collaboration and stuff, it's really been awesome. I don't think we would have gotten this far with the Syspro system if it wasn't for Imperium and your team. So thank you. And thank you.
Thank you for being such a great customer. And thank you for your time. And thanks, Brandon, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Before I hand over to Yanni Steyn, just to do the wrap up, a huge thank you to both of you for the collaborative presentation. I asked for kind of a discussion between the two of you, so thank you so much for keeping the energy going and not using PowerPoint slide for this discussion. It really epitomizes the collaboration between the customer and the partner, and of course Syspro, and understanding the benefits of Syspro, obviously using Zap BI, etc. I'm not going to steal Yanni Steyn's thunder, but it's really great to see the collaborative approach. Obviously in the RCL presentation, your presentation, working with partner, professional services, the customer, Syspro, etc. It is really very much a team effort. So thank you for partaking. There are 11 questions that I'm going to go through very quickly, if you don't mind. I think first to Russell Hollick. There's a question from Ravi Naidu. I think of Liquid ERP, and I think this is a customer that I'm part of at the moment. What Windows Server OS versions support the container option, Russell?
Hi, Brandon. Hi, everyone. So what I've done, I've actually taken all the questions that relate to me and put them into a little document here. So if it's okay with you, I'll read through the questions and then give the answers as I see them. I can always post into the chat as well. Okay, so I'm going to go in no particular sequence. Hopefully everyone's okay if I use their first name. So Ronnie asked a question. I'm led to believe that there's some clash with SRS reporting and Avanti. Is this correct? And if so, when will it be resolved? So my answer to that is the web UI is obviously a server-side architecture. As I showed, there's no client per se running any code. Normally our SRS Crystal reports will run on the client if you have client-side printing. So you have to use SRS with server-side reporting. And apart from that, there's no other clash that I'm aware of. If you do have any specific questions or issues, then obviously you can reach out to the service team, and if there's a problem, they will come to me. Ravi asked what Windows Server OS versions support the container option. So we use a container image that's built on Windows Server 2022. So you do have to have Windows Server 2022 or later, obviously, if there's one that comes out later. That contains the appropriate support for the Syspro web UI components that are mandatory for us to work with, so that older Windows Server images don't work effectively with our web UI. Jason asked a couple of questions. Will there be any change in the minimum requirement for the server now running the Syspro web UI? So that's a good question. There's a couple of points to that. The documentation provides some sizing that we've used for our testing. We've got several sizing servers, and with all the information about how those servers were configured. And that our live site that I mentioned has run successfully since December actually had one of those configurations to prove that those servers are appropriate. We also looked at our existing 8 client server sites running in the cloud that we support to ensure that we have appropriate sizing. And the other thing I'll mention on that is that, of course, you no longer, for those sites using the web UI, need a separate terminal server or individual PCs. So in some cases, of course, those things are quite expensive. And some people have found it more effective to have one central server, maybe that's slightly larger or more powerful, but it's simpler than and less expensive than having multiple other terminal servers. Jason also asked, will the containerization be available in SQL in order for us to use the data for insight tiles, possibly for IT governance? That's a very good question. The containers can be configured to dynamically load and close depending on the load, but I'm not 100% sure what is available for tiles. And I'm going to chase it up. I think it's a very good idea. I'm going to find out the answer to that. And if it doesn't do something, then I'm going to look and see if we can include that in a future release. Fem asked, when will the Syspro FAT client and/or web UI support SAML authentication, which is a form of open authentication, i.e. multi-factor authentication? So I've got an answer to that. It's a bit long, but here we go. The Syspro 8 2023 release, that is due in September this year, will include support for single sign-on. It's something my team are working on actively at the moment. And it will support single sign-on using identity providers. And this is both based on the OAuth standards. This new SSO logic will be supported for both desktop rich client and the web UI. So you can actually mix and match those quite easily. We'll initially ship support for the Microsoft, Google, and LinkedIn identity providers, but it is written as an open AI, so any third-party developers could integrate virtually any provider using any technology. Just to be clear, this means that when people log in, when configured, instead of using the traditional Syspro username and password, we instead use the configured identity provider's login dialog, including any multi-factor authentication. This could include, for example, Microsoft or Google Authenticator on your phone or tablet, depending on how it's configured. And the last question I'm going to answer here is Hassan asked a question. In my company, I have about 15 Syspro users. Will I be able to use Syspro Avanti with Server 2012, or do I need Server 2022? That's a very good question. So we've got many sites running successfully up to about 30 to 35 users. And in which case, then you don't need to use the containerized solution. So that should work effectively on the server that you currently have. If you're not sure, you can always speak to the Syspro Africa service team for confirmation with that. Obviously, if anyone else has any other questions, you're welcome to reach out to Brendan, who will then obviously forward any other questions you guys have onto me or the appropriate person. So hopefully that covers it off short and sweet, because there was quite a few questions and obviously a lot of interest, which is great. Thanks, Brendan.
Thank you, Russell. Appreciate the answers. A quick question for our guest speaker. Where do we find your book that you presented? Amazon exclusive books, are those possible? Nicola.
Hey, Brandon, let me just turn on my camera here, which is not, there we go. No, I lost you again, sorry. Let me keep talking like this. The book was at Exclusive Books. Unfortunately, we launched slap bang in the middle of COVID, which didn't do good things for the sales. But if I can suggest, if anybody's looking for it, I can see if we can find some back copies, or I can share anything in particular that's interesting. And maybe, Brandon, if anybody just wants to connect with me on LinkedIn, just look for Nicola Klein at Rotterdam School of Management. That would be great. Okay.
Great, thanks, Nicola.
Okay.
Thank you. A question for Frans from Tom. Multiple enhancement requests were put forward to inventory optimization some time back, specifically inclusion of stock usage, i.e. uses to determine Pareto analysis.
Yeah, so I'll, Simon, I don't know if you're aware of that one, but it's obviously around the raw material usage. So out the box, the IO addresses the demand and usage on the saleable items, whether they're made in or bought out. But obviously, there's a requirement to do the same on the raw materials if you want to run a disaggregated demand structure. And I know, Simon, you've done a lot of work around that. So, you know, you've done some customizations and modifications around IO so that it handles the raw material requirements.
Correct.
And my suggestion then is, you know, while the enhancements are still out there to be looked at, as the interim, is to have a chat with Simon, who has done a lot of work in that area. Simon?
And it's usually a very simple fix. It takes a few minutes to do, and then it runs as if it's there.
Okay.
So.
Good. I also saw there were a couple of other questions. There was one around training specifically. There's a lot of training material available around the IO modules. There are 3 modules involved. It's the forecasting, the families and groupings, and the actual inventory optimization engine. So there are courses available on the Learner channel. There's actually an entire certification channel dedicated to inventory optimization and those modules. So there's a lot of material certainly available in that sphere. From a commercial point of view, it's obviously tied to your user count. So there are modules that need to be licensed. So there is a commercial implication. Obviously, you know, from if you're wanting to discuss deploying these modules, obviously reach out to either myself or to Simon, who has, you know, been doing this for many, many years, and there's a wealth of experience in that field.
Okay, I just want to see last try if there's anything else, Franz.
There was also a question on the date windows that you can use.
Ah, yes. Yeah, sorry, you go ahead with that, Simon.
And that is absolutely the case. You can set up calendars at a weekly level, at a monthly level, at a quarterly level, and the data is held in daily buckets in Syspro, and you can view it. Franz actually showed that, but didn't point that out, that you could look at the data in daily buckets inside the modules. So it's very flexible that way.
Thank you,
and
Simon.
then was also a question on whether the features shown in Avanti are available in normal Syspro. Absolutely, yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we're just on time, or actually over time. I'm going to hand over to Yanni to conclude. Thank you again to everybody. Yanni?
Thank you, Brandon. I've got a lot of responses from people, and overall to all the speakers, well done. The majority of the attendees said that they really enjoyed it. Good presentations, very valuable to their companies. So I think to all the speakers, well done. To all the attendees, thanks for attending. And Nicola, thank you very much for your insightful presentation. I think one lesson I've learned is never to waste a crisis. And sometimes you have to swim. You can't always ride the wave. So sometimes you have to do some work. So I think from our side, thank you very much to all the attendees. Thanks to all the speakers. And Brandon, thanks to you and the team. It was really well organized and planned. And I think the presentations were really well done. Thank you all.